Late afternoon light poured itself over the station platform, turning the planks to gold and stretching every shadow into something long and patient. The air smelled of hot iron and wood dust mingled with the faint sweetness of prairie grass from beyond the town. May Calloway stood near the edge, the worn crutches under her arms pressing into her ribs, her parrot-green dress lifting faintly in the breeze stirred by the great maroon and silver train beside her. Her bare left foot, pale and thin from months of healing, hovered above the plank floor as though it no longer trusted the earth. She kept her chin high, though her eyes moved, quick glances to the depot windows, the mail rack, the backs of the men unloading freight. She knew most of them had stopped pretending not to look at her months ago. The widow with the limp, the one whose husband burned in his own barn. Pity was a smell she could detect in the air, stronger than the coal smoke. From the far end of the platform, he came. Elias Boone, the rancher who kept to himself so fiercely that rumors about him were the only way people remembered he existed. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with a black hat shadowing a face carved by wind and sun. A gun belt hung loose at his hip, not in threat, but as though it were another limb. His boots struck the boards in a steady rhythm that seemed to silence the station's chatter as he neared. May tightened her grip on the handle of her small, battered suitcase. The leather was scuffed to rawness, much like her hands. She could feel Martha Wickham's gaze from a mail window, Martha, whose appetite for other people's private grief was the stuff of legend. Elias stopped a few feet from her, the brim of his hat lifting just enough for his eyes, dark, steady, to meet hers. His voice, when it came, was low, rough with the gravel of someone who didn't use it often. "I need a wife," he said, "and you need strong sons." The words landed like a thrown rope, heavy and uninvited. May didn't flinch, but something inside her coiled. Not anger, exactly. Not surprise, either. More like the sting of being sized up, weighed, and measured without being asked. She stared at him for a long breath, then shifted her weight on the crutches until the wood creaked. Her knuckles whitened on the suitcase handle. She said nothing. Elias's gaze didn't change, no apology, no push. Only the faintest tip of his hat before he stepped past her toward the station doors. Martha's shadow flickered in the corner of her vision, disappearing with the slow stealth of someone who had just gathered enough to keep herself busy for weeks. The train hissed, readying to leave. May boarded without looking back, her crutches thumping softly against the floorboards of the car. She had no grand destination, only a plan to buy supplies, maybe speak to a cousin in the next town about sheltering her through winter. Every mile was distance from the weight of that offer, and yet the words seemed to ride the rails with her, their echo stubborn in her chest. In the small town down the line, she saw him again. Elias sat on a bench, hat in his lap, his eyes fixed on the far horizon, as if it might tell him a secret. He didn't glance her way, didn't speak. She walked past with her crutches clicking, and the silence between them was louder than any words might have been. She thought of the barn the night it burned, the crackle, the choking smoke, the timbers bowing before they fell. She remembered the heat on her face as she fled, her husband's voice shouting from within, "Get out!" The limp was not the worst of what she carried. Days later, she returned to her own small house at the edge of town, dust curling across the empty street like wandering spirits. She stepped off the train, crutches sinking slightly into the dry earth, her satchel lighter than she'd hoped. Elias was there, tying his horse outside the blacksmith's, hands sure and quiet. Their eyes met across the street, but he said nothing, and she passed on without breaking stride. That night, wind began to rattle the shutters. Rain came in hard sheets, drumming the roof until the sound seemed to fill her skull. Then 3 sharp knocks on the door. Elias stood there in the downpour, the brim of his hat dripping, his shirt plastered to his frame. "Fence down by the creek," he said. "Cattle wander. Thought you might want the extra milk in a week's time." She hesitated, unsure if it was charity or barter. His face gave no hint. She nodded once, the storm closing in around them like a curtain. He turned and vanished into it without another word. The next morning, she found hoofprints in the wet earth by her gate. Fresh. Close enough to know they'd been left there on purpose. She stood on the porch a long while, staring at the trail they made toward the hills, until the sun broke through the clouds and lit the grass in a sudden wash of green. In the days after the storm, May grew used to the sounds drifting in from the pasture. Lowing cattle, the muted clink of a water trough being filled, the distant creak of a saddle. She never saw him at work, but traces of Elias Boone lingered like a shadow stitched to the edges of her life. A broken hinge on the back gate was replaced. The sagging fence near the orchard was pulled straight and braced. Always done in silence, as if the man believed repairs should speak for themselves. The town, of course, noticed. Martha Whitcomb told anyone who'd listen that May had already agreed to marry him. By the week's end, the tale had grown teeth. Some claimed Elias had moved in, others that May had been seen riding his horse into the hills. She said nothing to stop it. Denial would only feed the appetite of those who lived for other people's stories. Elias, when told, only shrugged. People always need a story. Might as well let em keep one. It was the fire that changed everything. One late afternoon, a column of smoke rose sharp and black against the horizon, curling upward from the hills beyond Elias's land. Lightning had struck dry grass, and the summer wind had carried the spark. May stood on her porch, watching the smoke swell and spread until it looked like the sky itself was burning. She saw his silhouette on horseback, cutting across the far ridge at full gallop. She should have stayed inside. The crutches made every step across uneven ground a battle. But the thought of him alone against that blaze lodged like a burr under her skin. She filled a bucket, soaked a wool blanket in the trough, and started toward the fire line. The wind pushed hot against her face, carrying the bitter tang of scorched grass. Sparks hissed in the air, some catching on the hem of her dress before she could beat them away. Through the shifting veil of smoke, she caught sight of him. Elias was hacking at burning brush with a spade, his shirt dark with sweat and ash, his mouth set in a grim line. He saw her, and his shout carried above the roar, "Get back!" She didn't. A line of flame leapt toward a stand of dry sage. She swung the wet blanket down hard, smothering it, coughing until her ribs ached. Another spark landed near her bare foot. She stamped it out before it could take hold. The heat made her vision blur, the air heavy and thick. When the fire finally broke, when the last hiss of smoke rose from charred earth, Elias came to her. His beard was flecked with ash, eyes bright and sharp in the dimming light. Without a word, he took the crutches from her and lifted her into his arms. The world spun once as her weight left the ground, then steadied in the cradle of his hold. She didn't protest. Back at her house, he set her in the chair by the stove and poured a glass of water. The glass clicked faintly against the table as he set it before her. "You're not just strong," he said at last, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "You're stubborn as any man I've met." She met his gaze, her breath still uneven. "I've had to be." For days after, the scent of smoke clung to the air. The hills wore black scars where the fire had passed, but Elias's cattle grazed safe in the lower pasture. She thought he might come by to speak of it, but he didn't. Not until the morning, she found something waiting on her porch. It was a pair of leather boots, small enough for her injured foot yet sturdy, the kind meant for work, not church. Beside them lay a folded scrap of paper. The words were brief. "If you're going to fight fires, you'd better be dressed for it." It was signed simply E.B. That evening, he appeared at her fence. The sun was low, painting the fields in a soft amber haze. He rested his arms on the top rail, his hat pushed back slightly. "I meant what I said that day at the station," he told her. "But I'll add this. I don't need a wife who can bear strong sons. I need one who already is." The air between them held still, the moment balanced like a coin on its edge. She leaned her crutches against the porch post, testing her weight in the new boots. "Then you're late in asking," she said. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, and the wind carried the sound across the open land. Elias smiled, small, unhurried, and tipped his hat. Neither of them moved to end the silence that followed.